8 years on prime time, 30 million viewers a week, the wholesome dad of Full House. But off stage, he was secretly the dirtiest man in Hollywood. Did you know the American television empire, a machine built on strict family purity, was actively funding a mastermind of extreme graphic depravity? An unbreakable contract of silence. The mystery of the vulgar comedian hiding inside the perfect patriarch, Bob Saget. Was this flawless television father a corporate victim or the ultimate saboteur of the American living room? In the late 1980s, the American television industry was an uncompromising machine built to sell safety. Network executives demanded a sterile environment, free from real-world anxieties, to secure lucrative multinational endorsement contracts. A pristine public image was the only currency that mattered, and actors had to submit to a process of total sanitization. Running parallel to this was the underground stand-up comedy circuit, a brutal, unfiltered arena where performers weaponized vulgarity to dismantle social norms. Between these two worlds stood an impenetrable wall. The corporate machine possessed a zero-tolerance policy for off-screen deviance, where one wrong step meant absolute professional ruin. The system was meticulously designed to repel anomalies, yet it was about to invite its absolute antithesis right through the front door. The search for the perfect television dad started in an ABC boardroom in 1987. Network executives needed a new hit. The concept was simple but effective. 3 single men raising 3 young girls in San Francisco. The anchor of this show was the father, Danny Tanner. The writers gave him a specific backstory. A widower dealing with the sudden loss of his wife through an obsession with cleaning. Every week, he was required to deliver moral lessons and warm hugs within exactly 22 minutes. To sell this to advertisers, the network needed an actor who looked 100% safe. They needed a face that millions of parents could trust. The man ABC chose was Robert Lane Saget. Born in 1956 in Philadelphia, he grew up in a working-class Jewish family. His early life was filled with tragedy. His parents lost children in infancy, and he later watched his sisters battle fatal illnesses. To cope with the pain, his father, a supermarket executive, constantly made dark, inappropriate jokes. This environment taught young Saget a core lesson. When life gets too hard, a dirty joke is the best painkiller. He initially intended to pursue a career in medicine, driven by an inherent, desperate desire to heal the physical ailments ravaging his family members. However, an observant English teacher recognized his manic, creative energy and redirected him towards film studies at Temple University. It was at Temple University that the duality of his nature first became professionally apparent. He did not immediately gravitate towards vulgarity on camera. Instead, he directed a stark black and white documentary titled Through Adam's Eyes, which chronicled the painful journey of his nephew undergoing major reconstructive facial surgery. The film was an unflinching look at physical trauma and emotional resilience, earning Saget a Student Academy Award in 1978. This project proved that he possessed a profound capacity for empathy and an ability to navigate deep emotional pain. This underlying genuine warmth was the exact trait that television executives would later identify and exploit. They saw the empathy, but they completely ignored the psychological armor he was building to protect it. That armor was constructed in the stand-up comedy clubs of Los Angeles. Relocating to the West Coast during the comedy boom of the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saget walked straight into the legendary Comedy Store on the Sunset Strip. Managed by the formidable Mitzi Shore, the club was a brutal, uncompromising arena, dominated by figures who viewed the microphone as an instrument for cultural demolition. Comedians were tackling political corruption, racial tension, and societal hypocrisy with furious aggression. Saget, however, carved out a highly specific, deeply unsettling niche that set him apart from his peers. He developed a stage persona that relied entirely on the shock of extreme contrast. Physically, he resembled a friendly, gawky, affable boy next door, the kind of man you would trust to watch your children. But the moment he approached the microphone, often armed with an acoustic guitar, he would calmly and cheerfully deliver the most graphically explicit, structurally complex narratives imaginable. His art was not a matter of simply shouting banned words. His profanity operated with architectural precision. He crafted intricate, absurd stories concerning extreme sexual acts, bodily fluids, and severe moral transgressions, delivering them with the gentle rhythmic cadence of a children's television presenter. He sang cheerful melodies featuring horrifyingly explicit lyrics. The filth was a meticulously constructed defense mechanism. On stage, he was entirely in control of the horror. The comedy club, a dark room filled with intoxicated strangers, was ironically the only place he felt completely immune to the unpredictability of life, disease, and death. On stage, Bob Saget was a man who needed the darkness to breathe. What he feared most was not public rejection or critical failure. His greatest fear was being permanently confined to a sanitized artificial existence that denied the ugly, chaotic reality of human suffering. His fatal flaw was an absolute compulsive need to shatter boundaries, a psychological urge to say the most inappropriate thing possible simply because the rules dictated he should remain silent. Despite this aggressive stage persona, the television industry repeatedly attempted to harness his approachable physical demeanor. He took minor roles in sitcoms and served as a warm-up comedian for studio audiences, expertly manipulating crowds before broadcast. His first major television contract proved to be a spectacular disaster, highlighting the exact friction that would define his later career. In early 1987, CBS hired him as the comedic relief for the morning program, attempting to inject lighthearted humor into a rigid early morning news broadcast alongside serious journalists. The format was catastrophic for a performer of Saget's specific energy. He was tasked with providing safe, cheerful banter at 7 in the morning to an audience preparing for their commute. His subversive, unpredictable, and naturally edgy instincts fundamentally clashed with the sterile requirements of breakfast television. He felt creatively suffocated and deeply uncomfortable, and his performance reflected that alienation. After a brief, painful tenure, the network fired him. He was deemed too unpredictable, too difficult to seamlessly integrate into a highly structured, family-friendly broadcast environment. And then the ABC network appeared, the exact entity that was about to make a multi-million-dollar gamble on the very qualities that had just gotten him fired. The irony of the situation was absolute. Saget was not even the first choice to play the patriarch of their new flagship show, because he was contractually bound to the failing CBS morning show. During the initial casting phase, ABC moved forward and actually filmed the original pilot of the family sitcom with another actor, John Posey, in the lead role of Danny Tanner. The pilot was shot, the sets were built, and the initial investment was made. However, the network executives reviewing the footage felt a crucial element was missing. Posey played the role capably, but he lacked the specific neurotic warmth and manic underlying tension that the creators envisioned for their obsessive-compulsive widower. When CBS abruptly terminated Saget's contract, releasing him back into the industry as a fired, unpredictable comedian who spent his nights detailing acts of extreme depravity to late-night crowds, the ABC producers immediately launched an aggressive pursuit. They were so convinced that his inherent empathy, the same empathy visible in his student documentary years prior, could shine through a family-friendly script, that they authorized the massive financial expense of entirely reshooting the pilot episode just to insert him into the role. They looked at a man who fundamentally rejected sterility in his personal art and decided he was the ultimate anchor for their sterile corporate enterprise. The network executives were fully aware of his blue comedy background. They simply believed that their contracts, their PR machinery, and their paychecks were powerful enough to suppress it. The system needed a saint to sell their product. The comedian, recently fired and bearing the financial responsibilities of a young family, needed the stability of a network paycheck. The moment he signed that contract, stepping onto the brightly lit sound stage constructed in Los Angeles, he sealed himself inside a corporate vault. He agreed to wear the mask of the perfect American father. But the very thing that was about to draw the network and the comedian together, his ability to project a safe, warm exterior while harboring an intensely complex, chaotic, internal life, was also the exact thing that would turn him into a target for the industry's most ruthless enforcement mechanisms. Stepping onto the brightly lit soundstage at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, California, Bob Saget crossed an invisible threshold into a manufactured reality. The set of Full House was a masterpiece of corporate set design, awash in pastel colors, soft lighting, and an omnipresent sense of domestic safety. It was a physical manifestation of the American dream, constructed entirely of plywood and painted canvas. For a man accustomed to the cigarette-stained walls and hostile crowds of late-night comedy clubs, the environment was not merely unfamiliar, it was psychologically suffocating. The script for the first few episodes required him to deliver dialogue dripping in saccharine sentimentality. He was tasked with resolving complex emotional conflicts with a gentle smile and a rehearsed hug, all accompanied by a perfectly timed audio cue of audience awes. He was playing a man who found absolute fulfillment in a spotless kitchen counter. The friction between the performer and the material was immediate, visceral, and violently jarring. They did not choose trouble. Trouble chose them. Saget was immediately paired with two distinct co-stars who would act as his accomplices and enablers in the long years to come. Dave Coulier, an old friend from the stand-up circuit, played the eccentric Uncle Joey. John Stamos, a former soap opera heartthrob with a rebellious streak, played the cool rock and roll Uncle Jesse. Together, these three adult men were required to spend 12 to 14 hours a day trapped on a soundstage with a golden retriever and a rotating cast of child actors, most notably the infant Olsen twins. The tedious reality of sitcom production involves endless repetition. A single scene of domestic bliss requires dozens of takes, resetting the lighting, adjusting the camera angles, and coaxing performances out of toddlers. To survive the mind-numbing repetition of this sterile environment, Saget's deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism activated almost instinctively. He could not silence the comedian inside him. The moment the director yelled "cut," the saintly patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by the subversive club comic. Between takes, while still wearing Danny Tanner's conservative cardigans and neatly pressed trousers, Saget began to systematically dismantle the wholesome atmosphere of the set. He would lean in close to Stamos or Collier and deliver the most graphically explicit, shockingly vulgar punchlines imaginable. He weaponized the contrast, deliberately using his soft, reassuring television father voice to narrate stories of extreme sexual deviance or bodily horror. He would sketch lewd imagery onto the pristine props scattered around the Tanner family living room, carefully erasing them just seconds before the cameras rolled again. From that moment on, the question was no longer yes or no, but how long can it be kept secret? The reaction from the crew and his adult co-stars was a volatile mixture of nervous laughter and genuine shock. There was a deeply unsettling, almost creepy undertone to this behavior. It was the spectacle of a man actively rebelling against his own corporatized image in real time. Picture the surreal visual. Saget finishes a profoundly emotional scene, shedding a perfectly timed tear as he embraces his on-screen daughters, and within 3 seconds of the camera shutting off, he turns to the lighting technicians to simulate a lewd act with a household appliance. It was not malicious, nor was it directed at the children, who were shielded from the worst of his outbursts. It was an act of psychological survival. He was desperately trying to puncture the suffocating bubble of wholesomeness before he suffocated inside it. He needed to prove to himself and to the adults in the room that he had not been entirely consumed by the ABC network machine. The executives observing from the catwalks and video monitors were fully aware of the dual reality unfolding on their sound stage. The producers, Thomas L. Miller and Robert L. Boyette, watched their newly minted Patriarch unleash streams of profanity that would warrant immediate termination in any other corporate environment. Yet, they did not intervene. They did not fire him. When the early footage was shown to test audiences, the feedback was overwhelmingly, undeniably positive. The American public looked at Bob Saget and saw exactly what the network had hoped for: absolute safety, profound empathy, and unquestionable moral authority. The camera captured a warmth in his eyes that transcended the terrible dialogue. The viewers believed in Danny Tanner, and so a silent, binding contract was drafted in the shadows of the studio. The network executives made a calculated compromise. They would tolerate the filth, the crude drawings, and the graphic stories on the sound stage, provided that not a single drop of that darkness ever spilled over into the public broadcast. Saget was granted a bizarre form of backstage immunity. He could be as dirty as he needed to be behind closed doors, so long as he delivered the flawless, sanitized product when the red light on the camera illuminated. It was a Faustian bargain, sealed not with a signature, but with a syndication check. Saget accepted the terms. He needed the financial security for his own family, and he convinced himself that he could easily compartmentalize the two halves of his identity. In September 1987, Full House premiered to a national audience. The critics were brutal, dismissing the show as overly sentimental, predictable, and structurally weak. But the critics did not dictate the market. The viewers did. The series rapidly found its footing, connecting with millions of households seeking unchallenging, comforting entertainment. By its second season, it had morphed into an unstoppable cultural juggernaut. It anchored the network's incredibly lucrative TGIF Friday night programming block. Ratings skyrocketed, advertising revenue poured in, and the faces of the cast were plastered across lunchboxes, magazine covers, and promotional billboards from coast to coast. The trap had successfully snapped shut. The staggering, immediate success of the program fundamentally altered the power dynamic. In the beginning, Saget was simply an actor hired for a role. Now, he was the structural foundation of a multi-million-dollar corporate asset. The stakes were no longer merely his personal career. They involved the livelihoods of hundreds of crew members and the stock price of a major television network. He could not quit, and he could not rebel publicly. He was heavily compensated, immensely famous, and completely imprisoned by a character he fundamentally despised. The door was permanently closed. There was no returning to the anonymous, free-speaking life of a struggling club comedian. And just when they thought everything was under control, the system started to take notice. The sheer scale of Full House's popularity meant that the illusion of Danny Tanner had to be protected at all costs. The network realized that containing Saget's dark side to the physical soundstage was no longer sufficient. The paparazzi were beginning to circle, the tabloids were hungry for scandal, and the comedian's weekend excursions to local comedy clubs were becoming a massive corporate liability. The silent contract required enforcement. The executives recognized that they could not rely on the self-control of a man who instinctively pushed boundaries. They needed a machine to control the narrative. They needed to deploy the architects of Hollywood illusion to blindfold the public, to protect an asset that was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication revenue, merchandise sales, and advertising slots. The American broadcasting industry did not rely on chance. The network executives at ABC could no longer depend merely on the physical containment of the Warner Brothers soundstage to manage their increasingly unpredictable star. As the 1980s drew to a close, Full House was not just a television program. It was a foundational pillar of the network's corporate identity. And the central load-bearing column of that pillar was the unblemished, fiercely protected image of Danny Tanner. The terrifying reality for the public relations architects was that Bob Saget was not staying at home on his weekends. The compulsion to perform, to shatter the suffocating sterility of his daytime existence, drove him relentlessly back to the darkest corners of the Los Angeles comedy circuit. He was a man living two entirely incompatible lives simultaneously, and the collision of those two worlds was a statistical inevitability. The executives recognized that a proactive, aggressive intervention was required. They activated the Hollywood PR machine, a sophisticated, ruthlessly efficient mechanism designed entirely to manufacture and protect public perception. In the era before the internet, before ubiquitous smartphone cameras and instant digital outrage, information control was a physical, tangible operation. The power did not lie in algorithms. It lay in the hands of talent agents, crisis managers, and studio publicists who maintained absolute monopolistic control over media access. They were the fixers. Their job was not to promote the actor, but to enforce the illusion. The PR machine didn't need to physically stop Saget from performing. They merely needed to ensure his two distinct audiences never intersected. The studio instituted a draconian vetting process. Reporters were handed lists of pre-approved topics focused exclusively on family values. Any journalist who dared to broach the subject of his graphic stand-up routines was immediately blacklisted, losing access to the entire cast, including John Stamos and the immensely profitable Olsen twins. The entertainment press quietly agreed to the terms, becoming complicit in the deception. The system doesn't need to silence you. They just need to make you afraid to speak. Instead of merely hiding the comedian's dark side, the PR machine decided to actively drown it out. They initiated a campaign of absolute media saturation. The strategy was brutally simple. If you flood the market with enough images of the saint, the public will refuse to believe the existence of the sinner. Saget's face was plastered across the covers of TV Guide, People magazine, and family-oriented publications. He was booked on daytime talk shows where he was instructed to smile warmly, wear conservative knitwear, and project the exact cadence of his fictional counterpart. The system was actively rewriting his public DNA. They were constructing a fortress of wholesomeness around him, a fortress so dense and impenetrable that any whispers of his vulgarity would sound like absurd, malicious lies to the average American consumer. The ultimate manifestation of this velvet trap arrived in 1989. The network, eager to capitalize further on his unparalleled status as the nation's safest man, offered him the role of host for a new experimental television format, America's Funniest Home Videos. This was not merely a second job, it was the final definitive lock on his psychological prison. The premise of the show required Saget to stand in front of a live studio audience and provide high-pitched, goofy voiceovers for amateur VHS footage of people falling off bicycles or getting hit in the groin. It was the purest, most undiluted form of sanitized, lowest common denominator family entertainment ever devised. Financially, the offer was astronomical. It would elevate his wealth and national prominence to a staggering degree. But creatively, it was an execution sentence. By accepting the role, Saget was no longer just the patriarch of a fictional family. He was the undisputed, omnipresent king of clean American comedy. He was now broadcasting his immaculate persona into living rooms on both Friday nights and Sunday nights. The network had successfully weaponized his own ambition against him. They handed him the golden handcuffs, and he willingly locked them onto his own wrists. He was earning millions to stand on a stage and make silly voices, while the brilliant, transgressive, razor-sharp comic mind that had initially defined his career was being methodically suffocated under a mountain of corporate cash. The media executives did not have to threaten his career or launch smear campaigns to keep him in line. They simply bought his compliance. He was earning millions to broadcast his immaculate persona into living rooms on both Friday and Sunday nights, while the transgressive comic mind that defined his early career was being methodically suffocated. He was insulated from the consequences of his own dual nature, becoming a highly compensated co-author of his own erasure. The narrative arc of the exploited artist, crushed beneath the gears of a corporate television network, is a compelling Hollywood myth. It provides a convenient villain in the form of ruthless executives and an easy martyr in the form of the compromised comedian. But to apply that simplistic framework to Bob Saget's trajectory during the peak years of Full House and America's Funniest Home Videos is to fundamentally misunderstand the architecture of his survival. Saget was not merely a captive in the pastel-colored prison of the Warner Brothers sound stage. As the 1990s commenced and his cultural ubiquity reached a staggering zenith, a profound psychological shift occurred. The despair of his early years on the sitcom metastasized into a cold, calculated pragmatism. He stopped resisting the machine. Instead, he learned how to operate it. From now on, things would no longer be reactive. The turning point was not marked by a single explosive confrontation with the network brass, but rather by a quiet, cynical realization of his own economic leverage. The executives at ABC, the producers, the PR fixers, they had constructed an immaculate, impenetrable fortress of wholesomeness around him. They had spent millions of dollars convincing the American public that he was the ultimate embodiment of domestic safety. Saget realized that this fortress was not just a cage, it was a shield. The network had invested too much capital in the illusion of Danny Tanner to allow it to shatter. They were trapped by their own creation just as much as he was. This realization fundamentally altered his approach to his stand-up comedy. Prior to this, his weekend excursions into the dark comedy clubs of Los Angeles were acts of desperate, almost frantic rebellion. He was sneaking out to prove to himself that he still possessed a subversive voice. But as his fame solidified, the dynamic inverted. He began to understand the raw, explosive power of extreme contrast. He recognized that a graphic joke about sexual depravity or severe moral transgression, when delivered by a struggling, anonymous comic in a leather jacket, was simply shocking. But that exact same joke, delivered by the man who had just spent Friday night lecturing millions of children about the importance of sharing, was not just shocking. It was devastating. It was an act of cultural vandalism. Saget stopped trying to separate the two halves of his life and instead began to actively weaponize the friction between them. He became a comedic parasite, feeding off the massive wholesome host organism that the television network had built for him. He would stride onto the stages of the Comedy Store or the Laugh Factory, often still wearing the conservative, neatly pressed clothing of his television persona, and calmly survey the crowd. The audience, heavily populated by tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of the friendly television host, would sit in expectant silence, anticipating lighthearted anecdotes. He would then lean into the microphone and deliver an opening line so aggressively vulgar, so meticulously filthy, that the atmospheric pressure in the room would instantly change. He used the trust he had built on television to ambush his audience in the club. He would employ the exact, gentle, reassuring vocal cadence of Danny Tanner, the voice used to comfort a crying child on screen, to meticulously describe acts of extreme anatomical impossibility. He was not just performing dirty comedy, he was actively dismantling the psychological comfort of his audience in real time. He was taking the millions of dollars the network paid him to be a saint and using that financial security to fund his absolute freedom as a sinner. This was the ultimate subversion. The network executives thought they had purchased his soul, but in reality they had merely financed his rebellion. They were inadvertently paying for the most transgressive comedy act in America. Saget discovered that because his television persona was so incredibly rigid, so profoundly sterile, the recoil of his stand-up comedy was magnified exponentially. The tighter the network pulled the leash of wholesomeness on Friday night, the more violently he snapped it on Saturday night. He was hacking the system, using the vast resources of family entertainment to subsidize the darkest corners of his artistic output. He no longer feared exposure. He began to court it. He started slipping highly coded subversive elements into the television productions themselves, testing the boundaries of what the network's censors would tolerate. On the set of Full House, his backstage antics escalated from mere vulgarity to elaborate, meticulously planned acts of obscenity designed specifically to unsettle the adult crew members and co-stars. He was pushing the envelope, seeing exactly how far the network would go to protect their investment. He realized that the executives would rather ignore a mountain of horrific backstage behavior than risk a public scandal that could derail their billion-dollar syndication empire. He had them cornered. The psychological toll, however, was immense. Living a life of constant, deliberate contradiction requires a colossal expenditure of mental energy. To be the ultimate symbol of safety while simultaneously striving to be the most dangerous voice in the room is not a sustainable psychological architecture. He was playing a deeply cynical game, exploiting the hypocrisy of the entertainment industry, but in doing so, he was fundamentally fracturing his own identity. He was so busy manipulating the two masks he wore that the face beneath them began to blur. The pressure of maintaining a double life escalated daily, transforming the Warner Brothers soundstage into a psychological pressure cooker. The studio environment, originally designed to manufacture light-hearted family entertainment, had mutated into a bizarre arena of passive-aggressive rebellion. Saget's calculated strategy of weaponizing his wholesome image was no longer a secret confined to the dark corners of the Comedy Store. It was bleeding directly onto the brightly lit floor of Stage 24. The executives at ABC and the producing team of Miller Boyett were acutely aware of the shifting dynamic. They possessed a multi-billion-dollar asset that was actively, intentionally radiating toxicity behind the scenes. The corporate response was swift but heavily disguised. The network did not issue formal reprimands or threaten public termination. Doing so would require acknowledging the problem on paper, creating a legal trail that the tabloids could exploit. Instead, the intervention took the form of the classic Hollywood whisper network. Studio executives, men in sharp suits who rarely ventured down to the studio floor, began appearing with unsettling frequency. They would stand in the shadows behind the camera operators, their arms crossed, silently observing the cast during the rehearsals. They would pull Saget aside into the narrow corridors outside his dressing room for hushed, tense conversations. Initially, they were just suggesting something. They suggested he be more mindful of his environment. They suggested he consider the sensitivities of the crew. But suggesting, in the heavily corporatized language of Hollywood, is a polite way of saying follow through or disappear. But Saget had correctly calculated his own leverage. He knew they could not afford to fire Danny Tanner. Emboldened by this untouchable status, he escalated his behavior, creating an atmosphere on set that was deeply, fundamentally unsettling. The profound discomfort of this period was deeply rooted in the rigid mechanics of sitcom production. A television set is a workplace governed by strict schedules and professional boundaries. Saget systematically dismantled those boundaries, using the most graphic, unfiltered obscenity imaginable. This backstage rebellion, however, was no longer sufficient to bleed off the immense internal pressure he was experiencing. The claustrophobia of his public image was becoming unbearable. He was hosting America's Funniest Home Videos, broadcasting his high-pitched, sanitized voice to 30 million viewers a week. He was universally recognized as the safest man in the United States. The stand-up clubs provided temporary relief, but those performances were ephemeral, evaporating into the night. Saget needed something permanent. He needed to leave a permanent, undeniable scar on his own immaculate record. He needed the world to see the contrast he had spent a decade perfecting. The ultimate escalation, the moment the dam broke entirely, did not happen on live television. It happened in the form of a documentary. When comedians Penn Jillette and Paul Provenza approached Saget to participate in their 2005 film, The Aristocrats, they were handing him a loaded weapon. The premise of the documentary was simple: to chronicle the history of the world's dirtiest, most taboo inside joke. The joke itself is a structural framework. The setup and the punchline remain the same, but the comedian is challenged to fill the middle section with the most horrific, transgressive, and unimaginably vile acts they can articulate. It is an exercise in pushing the boundaries of free speech and human disgust. For Bob Saget, this was not merely a chance to participate in a comedy experiment. It was the ultimate opportunity for public detonation. When it was his turn to perform the joke for the documentary cameras, he did not hold back. He delivered a monologue of such extreme, staggering depravity that it shocked even the veteran comedians who had spent their lives studying the genre. He described the most extreme, unspeakable taboos with a clinical, almost cheerful precision. But the true horror and the true genius of his performance was not the language itself. It was the delivery. Saget did not shout. He did not look angry. He performed the most aggressively filthy monologue in the history of recorded comedy, while wearing the exact gentle smile of Danny Tanner. He used the warm, reassuring cadence of the television Patriarch to narrate an absolute nightmare. The visual and verbal contrast was violent. It was a masterclass in psychological disruption. He was looking directly into the camera, using the face the public trusted implicitly to violate every single moral standard that face represented. When the documentary was released, the footage of Saget immediately became the focal point of the film. It circulated rapidly, stripping away the carefully constructed PR narrative that the ABC network had spent years building. The executives could no longer protect the illusion because the man they had hired to project it had just actively, permanently dismantled it on film. The Danny Tanner shell shattered live and on camera, leaving the public to grapple with the debris. The release of the documentary footage did not serve as the grand liberating catharsis that Bob Saget might have subconsciously anticipated. When an individual has been entirely subsumed by a corporate identity for the better part of a decade, revealing the authentic self does not automatically grant freedom. Instead, it triggers a profound systemic rejection. The public, having been spoon-fed the flawless, sanitized image of Danny Tanner for years, did not watch his aggressively graphic comedy performance and applaud his artistic duality. They reacted with visceral, palpable disgust. The American audience felt a deep sense of parasocial betrayal. They had invited this man into their living rooms, trusted him to deliver moral instruction to their children, and relied upon his unthreatening demeanor as a cultural anchor. Witnessing him joyfully dismantle every boundary of human decency on film was not viewed as a brilliant comedic subversion. It was viewed as an act of hostility against the American family. The backlash was not necessarily a loud, coordinated boycott, but something far more insidious, a collective, stubborn refusal to accept reality. The masses simply rejected the vulgar Bob Saget. They demanded the immediate reinstatement of the television Patriarch. They wanted the mask back on. This is the precise juncture where the psychological cost of his dual existence transitioned from a manageable burden into a crushing, inescapable weight. He had finally shown the world his true face, and the world had turned away, demanding the corporate illusion instead. He was permanently trapped between the skewed perceptions of a society that absolutely refused to acknowledge his complexity. The sheer psychological agony of this period stemmed directly from the brutal contrast between the mechanics of television empathy and the devastating reality of genuine human grief. A television sitcom operates on a highly engineered emotional timetable. Within a strict 22-minute framework, a conflict is introduced, tension is manufactured, and a resolution is achieved. The problems encountered in the fictional Tanner household were inherently solvable. A teenager caught lying, a child struggling with a difficult school assignment, a minor misunderstanding between friends. These were the crises that Danny Tanner navigated. When the climax of the episode approached, the studio lighting would subtly shift to a warmer hue. A specific melancholic acoustic guitar chord would strike. The characters would sit on the edge of a perfectly made bed. Voices would lower to a reassuring whisper, and a perfectly articulated lesson about honesty, love, or forgiveness would be delivered. A long, comforting embrace would signal the end of the conflict. The slate was wiped clean. The universe was restored to absolute order. Every single week, Bob Saget was paid millions of dollars to embody a man who possessed the ultimate power to fix the world with a 5-minute conversation. The reality outside the soundstage walls was a relentless, chaotic nightmare that completely defied resolution. While Saget was busy dispensing manufactured television wisdom, his actual family was being systematically dismantled by profound, unstoppable medical tragedies. Now, the Saget family history was already shadowed by premature death, but the 1990s brought a sequence of blows that would shatter any human being. His sister Andrea suddenly suffered a massive brain aneurysm. The devastation was absolute and immediate. There was no gentle acoustic music. There was no 5-minute conversation that could reverse the neurological damage. She passed away, leaving a void that no amount of television syndication money could fill. Before the family could even process the sudden loss of Andrea, a second, infinitely more protracted tragedy commenced. His other sister, Gay, was diagnosed with systemic scleroderma, a rare, chronic, and exceptionally cruel autoimmune disease. Scleroderma causes the body's immune system to attack its own connective tissues. It is a slow, agonizing process where the skin thickens, internal organs become scarred, and the body essentially turns to stone from the inside out. Gay, a vibrant woman who worked as a teacher, was subjected to a torturous physical decline. The medical community was largely helpless against the progression of the disease at that time. This was the horrific, unvarnished reality that Bob Saget inhabited when he drove through the gates of the Warner Brothers lot every morning. He was forced to navigate an unbearable cognitive dissonance. He would spend his nights in sterile hospital rooms, watching his sister suffer unimaginable pain, holding the hand of a woman whose body was betraying her, feeling an absolute crushing sense of impotence. He was entirely powerless. All the wealth, influence, and fame he had amassed as a network television star meant absolutely nothing in the face of a terminal biological reality. He could not save her. Yet when the sun rose, he was legally and contractually obligated to drive to Burbank, step onto a brightly lit soundstage, and transform into a man who possessed all the answers. He had to sit in a makeup chair while professionals masked the exhaustion and grief around his eyes. He had to put on the neatly pressed sweater, step in front of 3 television cameras, and smile warmly. He had to deliver lines about the importance of family unity while his own family was being torn apart by disease. He had to feign deep paternal concern over a fictional child's lost bicycle or a minor playground dispute, projecting an aura of absolute control while inside he was screaming in the dark. This routine required an industrial, weaponized smile. It was a brutal form of physical and emotional acting. The directors would demand more warmth, more light, more reassuring energy for the cameras, entirely oblivious to, or professionally dismissive of, the fact that the actor was entirely hollowed out. The friction between the reality of death and the corporatized performance of life created a psychological fracture that could not be repaired. It is deeply unnatural to perform absolute joy and profound moral certainty while actively drowning in grief. The human brain is not designed to sustain that level of sustained hypocrisy without suffering severe structural damage. The stand-up comedy clubs, previously his sanctuary and his mechanism for rebellion, suddenly morphed into a bizarre purgatory. He still rushed to the microphone at night, desperate to shed the suffocating skin of Danny Tanner. But the nature of his comedy fundamentally shifted. The vulgarity was no longer merely a clever subversion of his wholesome image. It became a frantic and desperate scream. He used the filth, the graphic descriptions, and the abrasive language as a shield against the pain. He was trying to shock the audience, yes, but he was also trying to shock himself out of the numbness of his daily existence. He needed the chaotic, uncontrollable energy of the comedy club to prove that he was still alive, that he was not just a plastic figurine operating on a studio schedule. However, the audience at the clubs was completely unequipped to handle the reality of his performance. They did not look at the stage and see a man processing profound grief through the lens of extreme dark comedy. They saw a novelty act. They saw the guy from America's Funniest Home Videos saying horrific words. They laughed, not because they understood the intricate, painful architecture of his jokes, but simply because of the sheer incongruity of the situation. They were laughing at the mask slipping, entirely blind to the agony of the face beneath it. He would stand on stage delivering material forged in the darkest corners of human suffering, and the crowd would cheer, demanding he do the high-pitched voice he used when introducing videos of cats falling off televisions. This dynamic fostered an isolation that is almost impossible to quantify. He was the most famous father in America, recognized by millions, beloved by an entire generation. Yet he was fundamentally, absolutely alone. The silence that permeated his dressing room after a performance was not the peaceful silence of a job well done. It was the deafening silence of total alienation. When the audience laughter faded and the studio lights powered down, he was left staring into a mirror that reflected a corporate logo, not a human being. A quiet, empty room hurts infinitely more than a heated argument with a network executive. An argument implies a struggle, a fight for control. The silence of the dressing room was the sound of surrender. He had won the financial game. He had achieved absolute cultural ubiquity, but he had lost ownership of his own soul in the process. The specific consequence of this sustained deception was the complete erosion of his right to exist as a complex, nuanced individual. The public and the media stripped away his humanity and reduced him to a crude binary. He was either the immaculate, flawless saint of Friday night television, or he was the repulsive, shocking demon of the midnight comedy circuit. The actual man, a grieving brother, a terrified individual, a fiercely intelligent artist trying to navigate the absurdity of existence, was entirely erased from the narrative. When his sister Gay finally succumbed to her illness in 1994, at the age of 47, the American public offered their condolences to Danny Tanner, a fictional construct. They did not know how to mourn with Bob Saget because they did not know who Bob Saget actually was. He had successfully built the greatest illusion in television history, but he had walled himself up inside it. He could not grieve publicly without the media attempting to frame his tragedy through the lens of a sitcom narrative. He could not speak honestly about the darkness of his life because it violated the terms of the unwritten contract he had signed with the American viewer. He was forced to compartmentalize his mourning, locking his pain away so that it would not interfere with the syndication value of his television shows. He was a prisoner of his own success, guarded by public expectation and shackled by immense wealth. No one pressures you more than your own fear. The fear of losing the security, the fear of disappointing the millions of people who relied on his face for comfort, the fear of admitting that the entire edifice of his career was built on a monumental suppression of the truth. He policed his own behavior, maintained his own cage, and swallowed his own misery to keep the machine running. The price isn't losing a person. It's losing the right to live as oneself. He had traded his authenticity for a pastel-colored living room and a place in the cultural pantheon. He had allowed a television network to dictate the parameters of his reality, and in return he was granted everything a performer could ever desire, except the freedom to simply be. He became a ghost haunting his own life, watching a fictional version of himself receive the love and adoration that he, the flawed, hurting man, desperately needed, but could never truly accept. But the cruelest thing is that the public still thinks they're okay. They look at the reruns. They see the warm smile. They hear the gentle acoustic guitar, and they believe the illusion. They believe that the man on the screen was whole, that the safety he projected was real, and that the perfection of the sitcom family reflected a perfection in the actor's own life. They remain entirely oblivious to the silent, suffocating agony that funded their Friday night entertainment. And this is when the hoax is complete. If you piece it all together, the deception is not just a lie to the public, but rather a silent agreement to survive. Stripping away the emotional attachment to the sitcom era reveals the cold, mechanical reality of the entertainment industry that forged him. When we categorize the historical evidence, three absolute facts emerge from the pastel-colored wreckage of his television career. First, Bob Saget was a pioneer of unfiltered, aggressively boundary-pushing comedy. He did not merely dabble in vulgarity for shock value. He engineered a highly specific, structurally complex form of blue comedy that predated and influenced an entire generation of unapologetic stand-up comics. He was operating miles beyond the acceptable moral parameters of his time. Second, Full House and America's Funniest Home Videos were not just popular programs. They were unstoppable, multi-billion-dollar corporate cash machines. Their entire financial viability was predicated on the flawless maintenance of a completely manufactured, sterile illusion of the American family. Third, the Hollywood executives, the network presidents, and the PR architects knew absolutely everything. They possessed full knowledge of his dark, transgressive stage persona before they ever handed him the keys to their primetime empire. When we analyze these facts, the logical inferences are damning. The executives at ABC did not hire Saget because they believed he was a saint. They hired him because they calculated that their PR machinery was powerful enough to suppress his reality. The true deception locked at the core of this narrative is not that an actor lied about his personality. The deception is that A monolithic corporate system knowingly took one of the most abrasive, filthy, comedic minds in the country, dressed him in the unthreatening wardrobe of a grieving father, and sold him to the American public as a moral compass. They did this solely because the demographics indicated it would generate maximum advertising revenue. The system viewed Saget not as a person, but as a diversified portfolio. For the family-friendly advertisers, he was the ultimate safe asset. For the late-night comedy clubs, he was a lucrative, subversive draw. This was the profound cruelty of the Hollywood machine, compensating an artist so heavily with wealth and fame that they become the primary warden of their own psychological prison. The network provided the wealth. The actor provided the compliance. The industry made one final calculation. They assumed that after a decade of reciting wholesome dialogue and projecting absolute safety, the transgressive comedian beneath the mask would simply suffocate and die. They were wrong. If you look closely at the trajectory of Saget's career after the cancellation of his major network shows in the late 1990s, a fascinating rebellion unfolds. Rather than retreating into the shadows, he initiated a methodical, highly calculated campaign to shatter the Danny Tanner shell permanently. He recognized that the only way to reclaim his identity was to violently merge the two incompatible halves of his public persona. He decided to take the quiet, jarring contrast he had utilized in the comedy clubs and broadcast it to the entire world. The first major strike was his cameo in the 1998 comedy film Half-Baked. In a brief, explosive scene, Saget appeared as a recovering drug addict, delivering a line of dialogue so aggressively vulgar and unexpected that it fundamentally rewired the public's perception of him in a matter of seconds. It was a surgical strike against his own corporatized history. He was looking directly at the audience, using the face they associated with Friday night family lessons to acknowledge the darkest, most taboo elements of society. He escalated this strategy throughout the 2000s, most notably with his recurring appearances on the HBO series Entourage. On this program, he did not play a fictional character. He played a highly exaggerated, monstrously depraved version of Bob Saget. He portrayed himself as a cynical, hypersexualized, drug-abusing Hollywood elite. It was a brilliant, metatextual dismantling of the PR machine. He was weaponizing the public's shock. By leaning into the absolute antithesis of his television image, he was actively mocking the very system that had forced him to hide for a decade. He published a memoir titled Dirty Daddy, a book that laid bare the extreme grief, the filthy comedy, and the absurd contradictions of his existence. He refused to let the network dictate his legacy. He forced the world to look at the grime beneath the pristine surface. The system had attempted to break him into two separate products, but Saget ultimately managed to weld those pieces back together. He forged a new identity, one that acknowledged the warmth and genuine empathy of his television work while fully embracing the dark, transgressive reality of his comedic mind. He found a strange, jagged peace in the wreckage of his own manufactured image. He proved that an artist can survive the total commodification of their soul, provided they are willing to eventually burn the corporate blueprint to the ground. On the 9th of January 2022, Bob Saget passed away following sudden head trauma. His death immediately exposed the immense power of his dual existence. While an older generation mourned the ultimate symbol of 1990s domestic stability, a younger demographic scrolling through social media was violently confronted with his unfiltered stand-up routines. Saget forced society to confront its desperate need for flawless idols. He hijacked the corporate system, proving an artist can be deeply empathetic and incredibly profane simultaneously, leaving behind a legacy that refuses to be sanitized. In the next episode, we will dissect another massive architectural lie built by the entertainment industry. We will look at the exact same PR mechanisms, but applied to a different demographic. We will uncover the machinery behind a global teen pop idol who was legally and contractually forced to maintain a flawless, hyper-sanitized image of absolute innocence, while the corporate executives directing her career were ruthlessly exploiting, commodifying, and commercializing her sexuality to a global audience. We will examine the psychological destruction of a young woman caught in a system that demanded purity while selling provocation. If you want to keep opening these kinds of cases, where the truth is rewritten by those in power, you know what to do to avoid missing the next episode. History is more than just the surface, and together we will continue to dig into its darkest, most heavily guarded corners.